I hate when the lawyer comes to you when you're getting divorced. I don't like when your lawyer comes to you and goes, think you ought to settle. You know what I mean? There's going to be some things brought up. Just settle, okay? And I'm thinking, uh-oh, she's going to tell about me and that goat.
On December 10th, 2005, Richard Pryor, the groundbreaking comedian whose profanely personal insights into race relations and modern life made him one of Hollywood's biggest stars, died of a heart attack in Los Angeles. Pryor was beset by health problems throughout his adult life, due primarily to years of drug and alcohol abuse, and compounded by a multiple sclerosis diagnosis in 1986. The disease would eventually strip Pryor of his physical abilities, but his sharp wit remained intact, and he was able to remind audiences throughout the later stages of his career what a revolutionary talent he was. Pryor was regarded early on as one of the most foul-mouthed comics in the business, a reputation that initially relegated him to the fringes of mainstream comedy. His raw, unfiltered material, often laced with profanity, stood in sharp contrast to the more sanitized comics of his day. While this boundary-pushing style made it difficult for Pryor to gain widespread acceptance in traditional comedy circuits, it also set him apart as a daring and authentic performer. It wasn't until the 1970s that Pryor found his true voice, blending humor with social commentary. His routines tackled race relations, drug addiction, and his own troubled life, making him a pioneering figure in comedy. His albums, including That N-Word Is Crazy and Live on the Sunset Strip, cemented his status as a comedic genius. He also became a successful screenwriter. He co-wrote the 1974 Mel Brooks classic Blazing Saddles, and an actor, starring in a string of successful light comedies throughout the 1980s, many of which were suitable for children, and served to introduce him to a whole new audience that was otherwise unfamiliar with his comedy. But despite all the fame and success, Pryor's struggles with alcohol and drug addiction took a huge toll on his health and quality of life. He suffered his first of 3 heart attacks in 1976 when he was only 36 years old, and a few years later, he famously set himself on fire while freebasing cocaine. Many of Pryor's friends and colleagues suggested the fire may have been a suicide attempt, and Pryor later gave some credence to the claim. The fire resulted in severe burns over much of his body, but Pryor, predictably, turned even this tragedy into laughs, including during an unforgettable appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson.
A lot of things about life is important, because when that fire jumped on my all I could think about was life. I did. I screamed for God and the Son of God, the Mother of God, everybody. I was trying all religious symbols I could think of. I was trying to call, you know what I mean? I didn't call the Bank of America once.
Although Pryor had an uncanny ability to find humor even in the darkest moments, the years of substance abuse weakened his heart and other organs, and he suffered lifelong health consequences from the fire that nearly took his life. So as he grew older and the multiple sclerosis relentlessly progressed and compromised his nervous system, Pryor found himself unable to put up the same fiery resistance that had once defined him. And so on the morning of December 10, 2005, Pryor had a third and final heart attack at his house in Los Angeles. After his wife's failed attempts to resuscitate him, he was taken to a local hospital, where he was pronounced dead. Richard Pryor was 65 years old. I'm Jason Beckerman.
I'm Derek Kaufman.
This is Last Days, Richard Pryor.
Richard Pryor single-handedly transformed stand-up comedy by expanding the notion of what comedy could be. He was the first comic of any stature to blend serious subjects and humor, challenging both societal norms and the comedy industry itself. Generations of comedians of all races have been inspired by Pryor, but his influence on future generations of black comedians is immeasurable. Pryor's exploration of topics like racism, addiction, and poverty resonated deeply with black audiences, and he inspired many to follow his path of truth-telling through comedy. Eddie Murphy, Pryor's most well-known comedic successor, openly acknowledged Pryor's profound impact on his career. Here's Murphy presenting Pryor with a Lifetime Achievement Award in comedy in 1993.
Richard taught us that there was nothing funnier than the truth. And in 1974, he put out an album called That Nigga's Crazy. And he went on to prove it, too. Because he was crazy, but he was funny. And we loved him. And through his comedy, he opened the eyes and ears of the world. While people were laughing with Richard, they were learning to live with themselves and each other. Richard made it possible for comedians who follow to tell it like it is and to point out how it should be. I know Richard's probably upset and shocked a lot of people in his time, but he's made more people laugh.
Chris Rock said that Pryor, quote, wasn't just a comedian, he was a legend, a revolutionary. He showed that you could be funny and talk about serious stuff at the same time. And Dave Chappelle, who perhaps more than anyone else has followed Pryor's lead by building his comedy around sharp social critiques and insightful commentary on race and identity, referred to Pryor as, quote, the Picasso of our profession. In his 2005 acceptance speech for the Mark Twain Prize for American Humor, Chappelle said, quote, Richard Pryor changed everything. For me, he's the best there ever was.
Derek, at the risk of overstating it, if you look at the history of comedy in the 20th century, before Richard Pryor, there simply was nothing like him. I mean, Lenny Bruce was perhaps the only analog as someone who defied convention, but that was done more through his use of profanity and talking about sort of blue topics that other people didn't talk. And he was arrested many times in an earlier
He was an
age.
analog version. I mean, Lenny Bruce didn't have the fame of a Richard Pryor either. He wasn't a movie star.
That's
He
right.
wasn't able to transition to real mainstream appeal.
But no one, and I think to that point, no one was able to speak so candidly and openly about the American experience. And the fact that it was from the perspective of a black man was what made Pryor all sort of the more unique and provocative. I mean, there are certainly other black performers. You got Dick Gregory, you got Red Fox, but they either focused on activism like Gregory did, or really talked to sort of a white audience, appealed to a white audience in order to achieve mainstream fame. Then Pryor comes along and he just breaks down those barriers.
Yeah, he really did, and he dragged the world with him. What's interesting is he could have been, as you mentioned, a fringe comedian his whole career. He could have just been outside of the mainstream, a very provocative voice.
He was
There were those
successful.
voices. And you're right, and he became a huge success on his own terms. I love Red Fox. I think Red Fox is also a trailblazer, but his act was more palatable to white America at the time, and he sort of understood that. I think he got his respect. He got his flowers from people like Richard Pryor, but Richard Pryor truly just brought his act to the masses and won.
Yeah, and Pryor's comedy wasn't just about telling jokes. It exposed raw truths, tackled issues like systematic racism and police brutality, and the everyday struggles of black people with an unapologetic honesty that really had never been seen before in mainstream comedy. He built on the foundation of Gregory and Fox, like we talked about, but he took it to a much bolder, more personal space. Kevin Hart, obviously, today, probably the biggest African-American comedian in the business. He said, quote, he showed us that comedy could come from real life, from pain, and still be hilarious.
Pryor's humor developed as a means of survival amidst the chaos of his upbringing. Born in Peoria, Illinois, and raised in a brothel run by his grandmother, Pryor's mother was a prostitute, and his father was a pimp and part-time boxer. Pryor wrote in his biography that his father either ignored him and his mother or beat the shit out of him. There was no in-between. Things were so bad that one particularly nasty battle between his parents ended with his mother ripping open his father's scrotum. Pryor's mother fled when Richard was 10 years old, leaving him behind. This opened him up to incredible hardship. Pryor wrote that he was beaten, robbed, and sexually molested while growing up, but also moments of unexpected joy and independence. He said he developed his sense of humor as a coping mechanism and because it got him attention from the prostitutes and others who hung out at the brothel. Pryor started performing in small clubs in the mid-'60s as a way to pay the bills, and he brought the real-life stories of his trauma onto the stage with him. His raw brand of comedy quickly brought him notoriety, but it also rubbed plenty of people the wrong way. Pryor was fired by one Las Vegas hotel for yelling obscenities at the audience, and then in 1970 he quit in the middle of another Vegas show because the club owner censored his routine. Pryor yelled, "What the fuck am I doing here?" and walked off stage. But over the next few years, he honed his craft, maintaining the raw, honest, and edgy style, but making the humor more approachable. Then, in 1974, Blazing Saddles came out and was a smash success, and he released his first comedy album, That N-Word's Crazy, which became one of the best-selling albums of the year and won him a Grammy Award. 2 years later, he starred in his first movie, Silver Streak, with friend and collaborator Gene Wilder, and followed that up with a series of hits, including Car Wash, also in 1976, and Stir Crazy in 1978. Each of these movies beat box office expectations and exposed Pryor to a much wider audience, eventually leading him to inking a 5-year, $40 million contract with Columbia Pictures, just a staggeringly big contract at the time. Pryor was suddenly one of the highest-paid stars in Hollywood and the first black actor to carry his kind of leverage into studio negotiations. Hey guys, we're really excited that this episode is sponsored by Air Doctor. You know, Americans take about 20,000 breaths a day and spend an average of 90% of their time indoors. The indoor air that we breathe can be up to 100 times more polluted than outdoor air, according to the EPA. Indoor air pollutants can cause respiratory symptoms like sneezing, congestion, scratchy throat, and even more serious health problems like lung and heart disease.
So what's the solution? Introducing Air Doctor, the air purifier that filters out 99.99% of dangerous contaminants so your lungs don't have to. This includes allergens, pollen, pet dander, dust mites, mold spores, and even bacteria and viruses.
Air Doctor comes with a 30-day money-back guarantee, so if you don't love it, just send it back for a refund minus shipping. Head to airdoctorpro.com and use promo code LAST, and you'll receive up to $300 off air purifiers. Exclusive to podcast customers, you'll also receive a free 3-year warranty on any unit, which is an additional $84 value. Lock this special offer up by going to airdoctorpro.com. That's airdoctorpro.com and use promo code LAST.
So at this point, Pryor's star is shining as brightly as ever, and he returned to the comedy stage in 1979 at the Hollywood Palladium and recorded his first concert film, Richard Pryor Live in Concert, which solidified him as the biggest comic in the country. Now a true megastar, Pryor leaned on the unapologetically raw and unfiltered comedy of his youth, but with a more nuanced storytelling style. He again focused on taboo topics like his own battles with addiction, but with more sophistication and better comedic timing than in his earlier days as a comic. He talked about his parents, the abuse he suffered growing up in the brothel, and how Black Americans perceived white America. He was insightful, thoughtful, and always hilarious. Here's Pryor in a 1979 stand-up routine discussing police brutality of young Black men. A word of caution for sensitive listeners, Pryor freely uses the N-word throughout this set. Skip ahead 30 seconds if you prefer not to listen.
Police got a chokehold they use out here though, man. They choke niggas to death. That mean you be dead when they through. Right, did you know that? Wait, the niggas going, yeah, we know wife. No, I had no idea. Yeah, 2 grab your legs, 1 grab your head, it'll snap. Oh shit, he broke. Can you break a nigger? Is it okay? Let's check the manual. Yep, page 8, you can break a nigger right there. See? Let's drag him downtown. Okay.
One note about Pryor's use of the N-word. He used it constantly throughout the 1960s and 70s in his stand-up routines. Honestly, you couldn't get through a single sentence of his routines back then without hearing the word used a few times. And he used it as a way to address complexities of race in America and to make sharp social commentary. It was also just a very truthful way that he spoke outside of the comedy scene, and he brought that into stage. Then he took a trip to Kenya in late 1979, and Pryor said he was struck by what he perceived to be a heightened sense of dignity he saw in Black people there. And he talked about this very eloquently, and he talked about the fact that because they were not burdened by the baggage of slavery and systemic racism for all those years, they just carried themselves, again, with a heightened sense of dignity. He said he never realized how harmful and limiting the word can be. Here's Pryor in 1980 discussing his decision to stop referring to Black people using that term.
I was leaving, and I was sitting in the hotel, and a voice said to me, he said, look around, what do you see? And I said, I see all colors of people doing everything, you know. And the voice said, do you see any niggas? And I said, no. And I said, you know why? Because there aren't any. And it hit me like a shot, man. I started crying and shit. I was sitting there, I said, yeah, I've been here 3 weeks. I haven't even said it. I haven't even thought it. And it made me say, oh my God, I've been wrong. I've been wrong. I got to regroup my shit. I mean, I said, I ain't gonna never call another Black man a nigga. You know, because we never was no niggas. That's a word that's used to describe our own wretchedness.
I think it's interesting, though, Jason, that he didn't become a scold about it. It was sort of a personal reflection that he had. I've heard Richard Pryor talk about this a lot, and that trip to Kenya was monumental in his life because in Kenya, you're not a Black person. You're just a person.
Right.
The whole continent it looks the same way, and it really had a profound impact. But unlike someone like Bill Cosby, who would scold other Black comedians for using that word, Richard Pryor had this as a very personal thing to him.
Yeah,
he was going to stop using it, but he didn't scold others.
And you heard him in that clip. I mean, he really does use it as you said. Says this, for me, this is a personal journey, and I don't like the dehumanization that term brings on. And also he's talked many times about the fact that it's something that was labeled, it was a label imposed upon Black people by white America. And he said, sort of took umbrage with the fact that they have now, that he had for years, decades, utilized that sort of white man's term to refer to other Black people. And he said for him, it's not something he wanted to do. But, he loved Eddie Murphy, more, and Eddie Murphy used the word consistently throughout his comedy as well. So it's not like, to your point, he wasn't lecturing anybody else. He said, but for me, it's a personal choice.
That's right. And his epiphany marked a turning point in his comedy as he continued to confront these issues of race, but with newfound appreciation of the power of language. And as he said, its impact on self-perception and dignity. But of course, Pryor's success and commitment to dignity did nothing to address his profound addictions. The year after he released his live in concert album, which marked the high water mark of his career, he began freebasing, a method of using cocaine in its purest form, which is highly addictive. Freebasing cocaine became a frequent part of his routine, often driving him into bouts of paranoia, depression, and erratic behavior. Despite being married, he slept with dozens or perhaps even hundreds of people during this period, including his Superman 3 co-star Margot Kidder, and believe it or not, Marlon Brando. According to both Pryor's longtime friend Quincy Jones and Pryor's wife Jennifer, Pryor was open with his friends about his bisexuality, and he and Brando were known to have had at least one dalliance. In addition to the effect that the drugs were having on his personal life, they were undermining his career in subtle and not-so-subtle ways. Pryor's ability to work became inconsistent, and there were multiple reports of unprofessional behavior on set. He continued to make critically acclaimed films such as The Wiz in 1978, though behind the scenes, the pressure of maintaining his career and personal struggles was building. By 1980, Pryor said he freebased nearly every single day for 6 consecutive months until in June of that year, at the depths of his addiction and profoundly depressed, Pryor doused himself in rum and set himself on fire. He ran out of his house engulfed in flames and was eventually saved after being rushed to the hospital. Pryor initially said it was a freebasing accident, but he later came to believe he had done it deliberately in an effort to take his own life. Regardless, after 2 years of recovery, multiple skin grafts, and painful rehabilitation, Pryor returned to the stage in 1982 for Live on the Sunset Strip, an 80-minute stand-up set that was later released in movie theaters. It is widely considered Pryor's greatest work, and it has since become the benchmark for large arena shows. Dave Chappelle called the 80-minute set literally the blueprint for the kind of comedy I do, noting that Pryor, after 2 years of rehab and still obviously in pain, was able to once again set the standard for unflinching humor and honest storytelling in comedy.
I'm talking about fire is inspirational. They should use it in the Olympics. Because I did the 100-yard dash in 4.3. And you can tell when you fucked up, man. When you get to the hospital and the doctor go, ah! Holy shit. Why don't we get some coleslaw and serve this up? But I thank God every day, Jackie. I do. I say, God, thank you for not burning my dick. Because most people said, you've been punished by God. I say, no, if God wanted to punish my ass, he'd have burnt my dick. Now that's some punishment. Because when that fire hit my ass, my dick went to work. Said, emergency! Piss, come, do something! Keep the fire off the balls!
Pryor never stopped being funny, and despite having suffered burns to over 50% of his body, which left him physically and emotionally scarred for the rest of his life, he continued to work consistently. His first major role after the injury was as the unwitting villain in 1983's Superman 3, for which he was paid an astronomical, for the time, $4 million. And he co-hosted the Oscars that same year. He then starred in Brewster's Millions, briefly hosted a children's show called Pryor's Place, and played himself in a recurring role on Sesame Street.
You have this sort of figure that we're dealing with here. He's now famous for 2 reasons. Number one, he's a comedic genius, movie star, but he's also very famous as a drug addict, which all came out in the wake of the fire because he not only, news reports at the time covered it all the time, and he was sort of, there were whispers about him being a drug addict, but everybody who was sort of famous, it seemed, in the 70s and 80s was. So then he has this incident where he sets himself on fire, goes to the hospital. He's in the hospital for months, and there is nothing worse than being a burn victim. There's nothing worse recovering from than burn injury.
Excruciating.
He tells a story on stage about how he kept, in the first few days he's in the hospital, he was feeling okay. They had hopped up on drugs. And then they're like, this one nurse kept saying to him, we're going to take and get you a bath. We're going to get you cleaned up. It's going to feel better once you have the bath. And he was looking forward to it because the guy kept saying, we're going to get this bath. He's like, yeah, I want the bath. And he did a comedy routine, so he dragged it out. And then he eventually gets put into the water, and he takes, basically, the nurse takes a sponge to him. And the bath was to be rubbed down with the sponge. And it is, and Pryor is so funny in the delivery, but he conveys with it the horrific pain that he suffered through this. And so this went on for months. Anyway, got a little far afield, but he comes back out. Everybody's dying to see him. He takes the stage and he just goes for it in the Live on the Sunset Strip set, and really talks at great length, very honestly, about the pain, the rehab, drug addiction.
It's simply one of the most you'll never see a list of the most legendary comedic moments and not see that.
You and I were talking about this. It's sort of Eddie Murphy's Delirious, Richard Pryor live on Sunset Strip.
and then after that, there's a hodgepodge. Then personal taste comes into it, but really that is seen as the gold standard. It's in the top 5 of every list. And I didn't see it as a kid. I'm a little bit young to have seen Live at the Sunset Strip when it came out, but I grew up with Brewster's Millions and The Toy. And the thing about watching Richard Pryor was he was electric and he seemed dangerous. He was a family-friendly comedian in some ways. The Toy is a movie for kids, but it pushes the boundaries in very strange ways. And as a kid, I was very impressionable to watching Jackie Gleason and him do this sort of odd banter. It's a very strange thing. He owns the guy, makes him a toy for his rich son, and he's like nobody else. I don't think there's a lot of safe comedians now, and there's a lot of edgy comedians, but he sort of bridged it.
He was incredible. There were actually 2 movies that we learned in researching for this pod, 2 movies that he really wanted that he didn't end up getting. The first was History of the World Part 1. He was supposed to be in the Gregory Hines part. He had been hired for it and cast for it. Then the fire happens. It sort of launches Gregory Hines' career in a big way. And the second role that he really wanted, the audition for, was as Billy Ray Valentine, the character that ended up going to Eddie Murphy in Trading Places.
And launched Murphy.
I mean, Murphy was already on the come up, but
as a film star, Trading Places
brought him to a totally different level. And one of the most iconic roles of the entire decade, honestly. Yeah. And Murphy's unbelievable. It's hard to picture Pryor in the role. Pryor's about 10, 15 years older than Eddie Murphy.
Sounds about right.
But I think the character would have been fine in Richard Pryor's hands. I mean, it's hard to ever say that anybody's better than Eddie Murphy in any of the roles that he's had, honestly.
But if anyone could do it.
But if anybody could have done it, it was Pryor. And you can see, if you watch the movie, Eddie Murphy channeling Richard Pryor throughout that movie. We talked earlier about the fact that when Eddie Murphy would go on stage and he would do these impressions and he would do Richard Pryor, he would just blend straight into that voice, the cadence, effortlessly.
Yeah, really. Unlike his Bill Cosby where he'd put on a face and make the sort of eye roll of Bill Cosby, it was just flowed so naturally. He was clearly the successor to a guy like Richard Pryor.
But by the late 1980s, beginning to suffer the effects of multiple sclerosis and still ailing from the damage caused by the fire, he began to slip. In one of his last movies, the 1991 bomb Another You, Pryor's poor health was clearly evident. Pryor made a comeback attempt the following year, returning to stand-up in clubs and on television, but he just wasn't himself. He looked thin and frail, with noticeable speech and movement difficulties. By 1993, when Pryor was presented with a Lifetime Achievement Award at the American Comedy Award ceremony, he was barely able to stand or to speak. Pryor would say during this period that, quote, to be diagnosed with MS was the hardest thing because I didn't know what they were talking about. The doctor said, don't worry, in 3 months, you'll know. So I went about my business, and then one day it jumped me. I couldn't get up. Your muscles trick you. They did me. Pryor lived for another 12 years, rarely appearing in public and with profound physical difficulties, before passing away on December 10th, 2005. His widow, Jennifer, who married Pryor in 2001 and nursed him through the final years of his life, was quoted as saying, quote, at the end, there was a smile on his face. Richard Pryor, as we've discussed, left behind a nearly unparalleled legacy in comedy, forever changing the landscape with his fearless approach to stand-up. And no one was more influenced by Pryor than Eddie Murphy, as we talked about. He often credited Pryor as his greatest inspiration, adopting his candid style and pushing boundaries in his own iconic career. And so we'll give Eddie Murphy the final word. Here's Murphy on stage, recounting the time he called Richard Pryor to complain that Bill Cosby had warned Murphy to stop swearing so much while on stage.
I was pissed off. I was so mad, I called Richard Pryor's house up and said, yo, Richard, Bill Cosby just called me up and told me I was too dirty. And Richard said, the next time motherfucker call, tell him I said, suck my dick. I don't give a fuck. Whatever the fuck make the people laugh, say that shit. He said, do the people laugh when you say what you say? I said, yes. He said, do you get paid? I said, yes. He said, well, tell Bill. I said, have a Coke and a smile and shut the fuck up. Good.